Welcome to TradeTheNBI.com. This is John Support. For the 31st of March, and well, we've been continuing along at the peaks here, coming off the improvement that we had from DOC red here, which was indicating short-term buyers are green, and cyan we're approaching, but now we're starting to see a rejection here. Now the day's not finished, so this can certainly change. If this does persist, though, that would project potential weakness going into the peak. We have been in this rising gold period. Whenever we have rising gold on the shakeout, that's usually a continuation, particularly when it's over 50%. We expect to reach the 100%. We're already up there, so it doesn't really provide much help in that particular case. But the shakeout moving to a positive, we're at 0.05. So anytime we're above zero, you know that you've got positive market momentum within that. But this will be interesting because, too, also when we look at our NBI indicator, I'll go over in more detail the end of our 5K chart at the end of the video about the indicator and some of the things you can look for. But in this case, we look at the magenta over yellow as within the buy configuration, and particularly if the white is below zero, it's usually a pretty strong move. So until that changes, I think that you have to expect that you're still upward biased at this particular point. From an NQ standpoint, almost identical readings here with the separation, just the price differential between the Morganachis here. You're only at the 50% line versus the S&P, which is at 100%. That shows the lagging nature. However, if there's an improvement in the NASDAQ, it's certainly going to be reflected in the S&P, so definitely worth watching. But look at the shakeout in comparison, -8, and relatively ugly from its configuration as opposed to what we're seeing on the S&P. So some serious market divergences from at least power standpoint. Certainly the NASDAQ looks a lot weaker within that configuration. However, we do see almost identical DOC readings. So from an algorithm standpoint, they're just applying it at different price values. And there was that retrace of the dip below the red line for gold, all the way back to the zero. It's been pretty ugly shakeout here. With anytime you're below that -13 line, the little green one, you know that you've got some serious distribution going. Even when we started to pop back up, we barely got to the peak of it and then started the rollover. And we knew that immediately here when we had the cyan shorts rising over the green, just as a clear indication of stronger short interest in the coup de grace, so to speak, was the net steel. Short-term buyers crossed below cyan right there, and that was the hint that we were going to start our rollover, which we did. And of course, the euro also down at progressively lower levels. Again, you know, these are all, Europe continues to be locked down. I mean, even here in Italy, they just randomly decided to make everything a red zone. So effectively full lockdowns just because it's Easter time and they don't want people moving around. That's the nature of where we're at with things, regardless of vaccinations, whatever. So Europe is still way behind on that, and this is going to cause continued strain right there. Well, we'll look at the current 5K. This is where we're at. We've, towards the end of the day, had that dip, got bought back right at the end of the buzzer there, and then we sort of bounced back and forth in between here from that setup. What you see with these little dots, it's a setup for the buy turnarounds taking place within the overall NBI setups that we've already talked about, where obviously anytime you'll see on my chart I have an orange line here that represents merely a smoothing of the magenta, and I'll just substitute one into a, probably remove the orange and just leave it as the magenta one, just to make it easy to see. But it just creates more of a softer look to it. It's just a small adjustment within the algorithms to accommodate that, but I think that smoothing effect takes away from the heavy gyration, particularly that we see if we have the original cyan and light green, pretty erratic movements within that. But again, it becomes kind of straightforward. When you see this red above the blue-green here, and it remains there, that's pretty much your bullish case. When it dips below and you also have a sell signal, well, that becomes a different issue, assuming that your white here is not below that zero line, and that becomes that bullish case. I think we had it the other day where during the incline, if we scroll back, we can see pretty much stays underneath that 0 point. Well, actually, it's a 10 level. I'm sorry. The 0 actually is an interesting one because we were talking about that yesterday. These are the dotted lines. If we slide this down towards that 0 marker, magenta right here, the negative. When we go into negative numbers on the red MBI reading, usually you're very close to a turnaround pivot at that particular stage just because the nature of the numbers are not intended to go negative. So when they do, this is the same thing that we recognize from the Power Mode 2, where we have the green and magenta, and when it moves to a negative, you've got an inverse relationship, meaning a flip in the direction of where the algos have accumulated, and it's exactly what it creates. Now, it's usually a couple of bars later. It happened over here pretty quick from this one. This one I think was a little bit deeper, minus 4.3, and this one was minus 199. And we just had one right here too that was at well, literally just around 0.07, so just under 1, but just a fraction above the negative numbers. And you can see it produced immediate. It's not a guarantee that it's going to turn into anything positive, but in my view, it's one of those where it's like, okay, well, I then really tighten my stop to start to attack a negative, and as soon as I can see an uptick in anything, and particularly I'm looking at yellow or even the magenta, uptick is usually what it's going to take to drive that move, get that crossover. Sure enough, it's kind of an early warning system. And so a little bit later, I'll be converting these white dots into our turnaround green positions, which will be nice because, again, you can have these buy configurations that come up that then turn around to sells, and since we can see that so quickly, it's not going to be a problem being able to see those gyrations back and forth. Likewise, from a peak standpoint, let's verify that we're at the full end range of the day. There we go, back to the beginning of it. And that's where you see these. This is a setup referring to rising gold within it, and just making sure that our marking configurations for rising gold conditions still produce the same kind of net effect that we expect. And so far, pretty decent with that. What we're also looking at is the management within these blue candles, yellow candles for buys, and where we see them beginning to roll over early. That way they'll be able to flip, and that's the next approach I'm working on, and then you'll have the turnaround buy configurations that we'll set up. So a little bit more for an adjustment standpoint on that based on what we see from our combination here of the MBI indicator with the D Omega. And what's nice about it is that it's in effect incorporating the Power Mode 2, the shakeout, into its configuration readings, and just making it so that it's just not something that has to be looked at to balance against, because the colors of the candles will dictate the direction, making it plain and simple. I will probably go over further details as soon as I've isolated a few more of these setups. That way you can backtest it and we'll look at them. Also, I'm working on creating the functions for the additional lines for the MBI so that those will be available as well for anyone who wants to add them into programs. As always, though, we'll put our details up on the Skype chat. Trade well. We'll talk in later.